The rope cut into her wrists as the American soldier helped her down from the truck bed, dust rising in golden plumes. She had braced for kicks, for spit in her face. Instead, a man in a worn cowboy hat stepped forward. He didn't bark orders. He tipped his hat. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "you're not livestock. Not on my watch." Her breath caught. She'd been trained to expect cruelty, not courtesy. She blinked at the hand he offered. Then, in a whisper low enough to get him court-martialed, he said, "They'll use you and throw you away, but I won't let that happen." That sentence shattered something inside her. What followed wasn't rescue. It wasn't romance. It was rebellion, quiet, illegal, and soul-saving. One American medic broke the rules, not with bullets, but with bandages, gardens, and words no one else would say. In a world built to forget them, he helped them remember they were still human. The dust hung like a veil over the road, a fine gray skin that clung to eyelashes and lips, and the thin cotton of their torn uniforms as the truck lurched to a halt. The engine coughed, then died. Silence rushed in, thick and ringing, before the women felt their own breathing again. Some had not heard silence in weeks. Only artillery, only boots, only the wet choke of hunger. Now there was only the sun pressing down and the wooden sides of the truck burning against their palms as they waited for whatever came next. They had been marching for days before this. A broken column moving nowhere, nurses, typists, field clerks, no rifles, no rank, only a label that meant nothing now. Prisoner. The word had followed them like a ghost. They had whispered to one another in the night, telling stories of what American camps were like because fear needed a shape to survive. They spoke of cages and beatings, of shame so thick it made death seem polite. When the truck finally stopped, some of them closed their eyes, as if this were the moment the stories would grow teeth. Hannah didn't close hers. She had not slept enough for dreams. Her body had turned into a dull instrument, responding only to commands of pain and thirst. When the guard shouted for them to climb down, her legs didn't answer immediately. They trembled as if they belonged to someone else. The girl beside her, a radio operator with cracked lips, tried to steady her, but her own hands were shaking too hard. They stepped down one by one, boots hitting ground that looked too clean for war. No craters, no twisted metal, just red Philippine earth and a line of low barracks in the distance. Hannah's vision blurred. The heat seemed to move in waves. She felt the ground tilt as if the world were finally turning away from her, and then her knees gave out. For a second, no one moved. She waited for the sting of a boot, for a hand yanking her up by the collar. Instead, there was a shadow across her face, not sharp, soft. She tried to look up, but only caught the shape of a hat brim cutting the sunlight. A hand came into view, large, calloused, careful. "You all right, ma'am?" The word struck her harder than the fall. No officer had called her that, not once. Not when she had been bleeding beside a field station or carrying morphine through shell fire. Ma'am belonged to another world. She thought maybe she had imagined it. The man crouched, his knees bending easily, his boots sinking slightly into the dust. He smelled faintly of soap and something else, something like hay or leather. His sleeve was rolled, showing an arm tanned almost the color of old wood. On his collar, the insignia of a medic. He didn't pull her. He waited, as though she were not a body to be managed, but a person deciding whether to trust him. His voice was low, a drawl that made the words stretch, not for laziness, but gentleness. "Easy now," he said. "I got you." Around them, other guards barked orders in English, sharp and clipped. "Line up! Move forward! Count them!" The sound of authority was everywhere, but this man spoke as though there were no audience, as though rules softened when no one important was watching. He guided Hana's arm across his shoulder and lifted slowly, not with force, but with some quiet awareness of how bones ache when they are tired of holding themselves together. Her weight must have been almost nothing by then. She felt herself sway, embarrassingly light, like a scrap of cloth. "Name?" he asked, not for paperwork, not loud enough for anyone else to hear. She hesitated. Names could be used, for lists, for punishment. But she said it anyway. "Hana." He nodded once, as though filing it somewhere that wasn't on a form. "Pleased to meet you, Hana. Folks call me Cowboy." She almost laughed. The word sounded unreal. Cowboy, like a character from a picture show she had only heard about from whispered rumors. A man on a horse, under an endless sky. Not here, not in a place where fences were already stretching along the horizon. He moved her to the side of the truck, where the sun struck less fiercely. He pressed a canteen to her hands. The metal was cool. She stared at it, suspicion burning faintly through her exhaustion. He understood. Didn't rush her, just waited. When she finally drank, the water felt like a shock to her system, cold and clean, like rain she had forgotten could exist. "They'll try to make you disappear," he said softly, his eyes not leaving the camp road ahead. "Move you, work you, forget you were ever here." Her fingers tightened around the canteen. "They'll use you and throw you away," he went on, his voice so low it almost vanished into the dust. Then he glanced at her, just once, something like defiance, sitting quiet behind his eyes. "But I won't let that happen. Not if I can help it." It was an illegal thing to say. She didn't know that yet. Not the codes, not the punishment. But she knew tone. She knew when words carried risk. His weren't said to comfort. They were said like a line drawn in dirt. Around them, the camp kept moving. Guards calling numbers, birds somewhere beyond the wire still singing as if the war had never passed through. But inside Hana, something had shifted, like a bone cracking back into place. Not hope, not yet. Just the first small, impossible idea that maybe, in this place meant to erase her, one man had decided to see her instead. It was a dangerous idea, more dangerous in some ways than the rifles lining the fence or the roll calls at dawn, because Hana had not been trained to survive. She had been trained to vanish, to die before capture, to bleed out quietly, nobly, and without question. Bushido had drilled it into her bones. Surrender was shame, mercy was deception, kindness was camouflage for cruelty. If the enemy ever smiled, it meant the blade was coming. So when Cowboy brought her soup the next morning, she stared at it like it was a trick. The bowl trembled in her hands. It was real porcelain, chipped but clean. Steam curled from the surface in soft, fragrant wisps. The scent of miso, of vegetables she hadn't tasted in months, of something resembling home. She didn't move. She expected a slap, a laugh, a camera flash to use her humiliation for propaganda. But none came. Cowboy just crouched again, always crouching like he didn't want to tower over anyone, and said, "Ain't much, but it's warm." Then he walked away. That was the most unnerving part. He didn't linger for gratitude, didn't wait for her to eat. He treated her not like a prisoner, not like a burden, but like someone who was supposed to be fed. The idea staggered her more than hunger. The other women were no less wary. They whispered at night in halting phrases, always in questions. Had anyone been beaten? Had anyone been touched? Why did the guards speak quietly? Why were they given blankets? Real ones, with stitching and tags, like the kind in childhood beds before the war had turned them into soldiers. Hannah watched as one of the women hid her bread under her cot, convinced the meals would stop, that the punishment would come when they were full and unsuspecting. The camp itself was absurdly clean. There were flowers blooming in a line beside the latrines. Buckets for hand-washing sat beside soap that smelled like lavender. Hannah remembered an old woman in Osaka who had once traded a family heirloom, a comb of ivory, for a sliver of lye soap. Here they were given whole bars, unwrapped, smooth in the hand. They all noticed the silence. That was the strangest thing. There were no screams, no barked lectures. The guards didn't leer. They didn't joke. They treated the women with the same tone they used for their own, or perhaps even gentler. There was no forced cheer, no overcompensation, just an eerie, suffocating normalcy. It didn't make sense, which is why it terrified them. Cowboy became a kind of myth inside that paradox. His accent, his hat, the way he hummed under his breath when he cleaned wounds. He gave every woman the same softness, not favoritism, just dignity. He learned their names, not all, not right away, but enough. He brought a book in Japanese from somewhere, and when he handed it to one of the translators, he said, "Figure they might want to read something that don't come from a clipboard." He showed Hannah how to drink coffee. That, too, was a lesson. He gestured gently, sip, not slurp, then smiled when she winced at the bitterness. "Takes getting used to," he said, not mocking. She tried to hide her cough, but he just handed her sugar next time without saying a word. One afternoon, a higher officer arrived, inspecting the barracks with a clipboard and a sour look. Cowboy snapped to attention like the rest of them. The women tensed. Afterward, Cowboy didn't speak for hours. His smile vanished. That evening, Hannah found her bandages changed again, carefully, even though she hadn't asked. She realized that silence was his shield. He hadn't stopped caring. He'd simply been watched. His kindness wasn't accidental. It was chosen, repeated, dangerous. Hannah didn't understand it yet. None of them did. But they began to shift, imperceptibly. They sat closer together during meals. They spoke more freely. One girl from Nagasaki even laughed, a sharp, startled sound, and no one silenced her. They were still prisoners. There was still wire and guards and watchtowers, but something inside the fence was cracking open. Not because the war had ended, but because one man, one quiet, stubborn medic in dusty boots, had decided that mercy wasn't a weakness. It was resistance. But resistance, no matter how gentle, has a price. It didn't take long. One morning, Cowboy's drawl was absent from the infirmary. His rounds stopped. The other guards moved differently around him, stiffer, cooler. When he reappeared near the end of the week, there was a fresh crease in his uniform and a quiet that hadn't been there before. He didn't meet anyone's eyes. His hands were still steady, but slower, as though each movement had been weighed and approved. The rumors came quickly. He had been called in by the senior officer. Inappropriate empathy, someone said. Unmilitary conduct. The words buzzed like flies around the barracks, too absurd to touch, but too dangerous to ignore. Hannah didn't need confirmation. She saw it in the way Cowboy's smile now ended behind his eyes, like a door closed just before you reached it. The risk of kindness, she understood now, wasn't just for the prisoners. It had consequences for the ones who gave it too freely. Then the orders came. A clipboard, a list of names, a map tacked to a post. The women were to be moved. Not all, but enough. The words were sterile. Reassignment. Labor rotation. Logistical necessity. But every woman knew what it meant. Hard work, no oversight, distant postings where men forgot you had a name. Hana watched the translator's face as he read the orders aloud. His lips tightened. When one woman asked if they would return, he didn't answer. That night, the mood in the barracks turned brittle. Some packed in silence. Others didn't pack at all. One woman wept into her sleeves. Another sharpened a wooden spoon against a concrete step, over and over, not to fight, just to feel like she still could. Hana sat by the window, staring out at the wire. A breeze slipped through the slats, but it brought no comfort. Her palms were blistered from helping in the kitchen, carrying tins, scouring pots, chopping what little vegetables the guards handed over. She hadn't complained. The work kept her moving. It made the hours vanish. But now, each pulse of pain reminded her that the camp had never been safe, just quiet. She thought back to her training. Not the nursing drills, but the first days at base, before the white coats and gauze and field medicine. The morning they were made to kneel in the rain, uniforms stiff with starch, listening to the officer's voice rise above the storm. "There is no greater shame," he had said, "than surrender. If you are captured, you are already dead. Do not shame your ancestors by begging. Do not expect to be rescued. You will not be remembered. You will be erased." He made them repeat it, not once, over and over. She had whispered it in unison with the others, the rain crawling down her scalp like a second skin. By the third time, it was no longer a warning. It was a vow. Now, years later, she was being told she might be sent away, to break rocks, to clean latrines, to disappear quietly behind some far fence. The oath whispered from her past like a wound that never closed. She didn't cry. She hadn't in months. But she didn't sleep either. When Cowboy returned, he said nothing. He found her beside the barrack wall, hands red and raw from peeling taro root for the midday meal. He didn't ask. He just knelt, gently unwrapping the stained cloth she'd used as a bandage. The skin underneath had split, angry with infection. He cleaned the cuts, slow, careful, silent. She stared at his face, not the hat, not the hands, just his eyes. They looked tired, but not broken. When he finished, he tied fresh cloth around each palm, not too tight, she could still move. Then he sat back on his heels and looked at her. For a long time, neither of them spoke, and then, just barely above the wind, she said, "They told me I should be dead already." Cowboy nodded once. "They tell a lot of things." The next morning, her name was still on the transfer list, but so was a note, one she hadn't seen before, scribbled next to her name in pencil, "Unfit for labor, medical hold." She never saw him write it, never asked, but the bandages were clean, and her hands, though trembling, could still hold a spoon. And in that there was still choice, still defiance, still a thin thread of dignity wrapped in cotton and silence. The next morning the air smelled different, not of bleach or boiled rice or the metallic scent of bandages soaking in tin basins. It smelled like damp earth. It startled Hana more than the whistle for roll call. She noticed it when she stepped out of the barrack and felt the ground beneath her bare soles, cool and dark from the night rain. A smell from another life, a smell that did not belong inside fences. She almost didn't see the pouch at first. It rested where the wood of the barrack met the dirt, half-shadowed, as if embarrassed by its own presence. A scrap of cloth, tied clumsily with twine. No note, no explanation, just waiting. She knelt slowly, every movement cautious, and lifted it. The fabric was coarse but dry. Inside, when she loosened the string, her breath caught. Seeds, tiny, brown, some round, some long and pale like the bones of insects. She looked around instinctively, heart thudding as though she had been handed a weapon. Cowboy stood near the infirmary door, talking to another guard. He didn't look her way, didn't nod, didn't smile. But when the other man walked off, Cowboy tilted his head just slightly, like he was listening to something only he could hear. "Grow something," he said, not turning around. He said it like a suggestion, but it felt like a command carved out of kindness. She nearly dropped the pouch. Later, when she could slip away without drawing attention, she found a patch of earth behind the latrines, where the ground was softer from splashed water and the guards rarely bothered to look. A useless corner, a forgotten strip. The kind of place where weeds tried to live but were trampled before they could remember how. She knelt there, hands still wrapped in bandage, fingers clumsy. She scooped the earth aside with a broken spoon. The metal scraped, but the soil gave. It welcomed the cut. She didn't know why she did it. She didn't know what the seeds would become or if they would grow at all. But the act itself felt like an answer to something she had not been asked. The first days, nothing happened. The dirt stayed dirt, the sky stayed bitter blue, and the world remained caged. One of the other women noticed her kneeling, a former schoolteacher from Kyoto, older, careful, with eyes that had already buried too many things. She didn't ask. She just crouched beside her and placed her fingers in the soil, too, as if it were a memory she shared without needing to know why. Then another came, a younger one with a laugh she tried to hide. Then another. No one spoke. They just worked. Quiet hands, quiet collaboration, quiet rebellion. It was the first time since their capture that they were doing something not ordered, not scheduled, not forced. They returned each morning, and each evening, bringing water in small cups stolen from the wash station, using sleeve hems to wipe leaves that did not yet exist, guarding the dirt with their bodies when others walked too near. And then, one morning, Hannah saw it, a thin green line just breaking the skin of the earth, like a sentence beginning. Her throat tightened. She pressed her hand over her mouth, not to stop a cry, but to keep something sacred from spilling out. It was a sprout, small, weak, but upright. "They are coming," someone whispered behind her. And they did. Cowboy didn't say anything. He paused, glanced at the new green against the dirt, then back at Hannah. He nodded once. After that, more appeared. Another vine, a round leaf curling like a fist uncurling. Something that might be tomato, something that might be lettuce. The women whispered guesses as though they were recalling forgotten names of children. They tended the garden like nurses tending survivors, gently, daily, with a fierce patience. The guards didn't comment. Perhaps they didn't see it, or perhaps they pretended not to. A blind eye can be a form of mercy, too. As the leaves grew, the women changed. They began to share their rations without instruction. They sang under their breath while watering, not marches, old household lullabies, songs their mothers used to hum over rice and laundry. Hannah noticed something else, quieter. She began thinking not as a prisoner, waiting to be moved or erased, but as a caretaker, someone responsible for something living, something fragile that depended on her attention. Each morning she inspected the soil before she spoke to anyone. Each afternoon she wondered if it needed more water or less sun. Each evening she whispered to it, not prayers, just observations. "You are growing. You are still here." She realized then that Cowboy hadn't only given her seeds. He had given her a future tense. That future cracked the moment the new orders arrived. They were delivered the way all cruel things are, cleanly typed, sealed in a folder, and read aloud with no inflection. A clipboard officer stood at the edge of the barracks, flanked by two armed guards who didn't bother looking up. His English words were translated into clipped Japanese. Relocation, labor redistribution, island posting. He might as well have said exile or execution. Half the women were chosen, no appeals, no explanation. They were to pack what they had, which was nearly nothing, and prepare to move at sunrise. Their destination, an island further south, better suited to physical utility. No one explained what that meant, but the older women understood. Hannah's name was not on the list this time, but she felt every syllable of the others' fates as if they had been carved into her own skin. Cowboy heard about it hours later. He burst into the administration office without knocking, the brim of his hat clenched in one hand, the other trembling in a fist he kept pressed against his thigh. The officer didn't even look up when he spoke. "You send 'em there. They'll die out there," Cowboy said. His voice was calm, but every word landed like a hammer. "They ain't soldiers. They ain't ready. Some of 'em still bleedin'. Not your call, Corporal. They're sick. They're prisoners." Cowboy stood for a long time after that, staring at the desk. Then he nodded once and left without a word. But something in his spine had bent visibly. The weight of the uniform, the silence, the helplessness, all of it coiled inside him like wire pulled too tight. That night, the barracks were quieter than usual. No humming, no whispers, just the sound of fabric being folded, footsteps on wood, and the scratch of old pencils scribbling names onto scraps of cloth so the dead could be identified later. Hannah sat on her cot, hands still smelling faintly of soil from the garden. Her eyes refused to close. The women who were leaving tried to smile at the ones who were staying. A few even joked. It was the cruelest kindness, a desperate attempt to make the unbearable seem survivable. And then she saw it, a paper, folded 3 times, tucked beneath her blanket like a secret breath. Her fingers opened it carefully. The handwriting was rushed but familiar. "Wait!" That was all it said. One word, one fragile command. She didn't know if it was from Cowboy. She didn't know what it meant, but it lit something inside her chest that burned hotter than any order, any speech, any cruel efficiency pretending to be organization. Because someone, somewhere, still believed there was a sliver of time left, a crack in the system, a breath between commands. Bureaucracy marched forward the next morning as expected. Trucks arrived, women climbed aboard with faces like stone, guards counted heads like cargo. The sun rose, indifferent, but Hannah stayed, behind, pretending a fever. Cowboy said nothing. He just handed the officer a note. "Medical exemption. We'll monitor." And it worked. No one looked closer. No one cared enough. By nightfall, the trucks were gone. The barracks felt hollow without the voices, but Hannah remained. Her breath still fogged the window pane. Her pulse still thudded against the silence. The system had not broken, but something inside it had bent. Because somewhere a folded paper had whispered back to the machinery, "Not yet." The morning arrived without ceremony. No sirens, no shouts, just the usual boots on gravel, the usual clipboard checks, the usual rehearsed silence among the women. Except this time, Hannah didn't look away when Cowboy passed. She met his eyes, and he nodded, not to her, but as if to a question he had already answered. The trucks pulled up exactly on schedule, rattling and loud, dust spinning from the tires like dry smoke. The sun was just beginning to bleach the sky when the names were read. One by one, the chosen were marched forward. The guards barely looked at the faces, just checked names off a paper. Except that paper didn't match the truth. Unseen, behind the machine, something small had been rewritten. It had taken one bribe. A tin of cigarettes and a pair of boots traded for silence. One forged page slipped into the morning manifest, one switch of names from column A to B just before the originals were burned. No alarms, no fences cut, just the quiet treason of ink on paper. Cowboy didn't say anything when it was done. He didn't need to. As the trucks groaned away, Hannah stood behind the barracks with 3 others, the ones who were supposed to be gone. They watched from behind the laundry line, hearts slamming like fists in their chests. No one looked for them. No one counted again. They were safe, not forever, but for now. After the dust settled, the camp returned to its slow rhythm. Mess call, clean-up, inspection. But something had shifted in the air, not among the guards, who never noticed, among the women. That afternoon, Hannah found Cowboy near the garden. He was kneeling, fixing the wire fencing that kept wild chickens out. He didn't glance up as she approached. She stood there for a long moment, unsure what words could stretch far enough to meet the enormity of what he'd done. He beat her to it, barely. "Tomatoes are looking all right," he said, brushing dirt off his hands. "Might even get some by next week." Hannah smiled, small, tired, but real. "If the chickens don't get them first." That was all. No thank you, no confession, nothing that could be recorded or used, just 2 people standing beside something green in a place that had been built to be gray. It was then, without ceremony, that ideology began to fall away, because Hannah had believed in absolutes once: duty, shame, glory, death. But what Cowboy had done didn't fit inside any of them. He hadn't saved her with honor or rank or the right flag. He had done it quietly, dangerously, and without permission. Not for reward, not for pride, just because he could. And that realization did more than save her body. It rewrote her belief. That night, she wrote the names of the other 3 women on the back of the seed pouch he had given her, as if recording proof that they had not vanished. She tucked it under her cot, beside the paper that had told her to wait. And then she slept. For the first time in weeks, she dreamed not of marches or sirens or shame. She dreamed of a garden growing so wild that the fence could no longer hold it. The dream evaporated with the heat of morning, replaced by a silence that settled over the camp like fog. Not the normal stillness of routine or exhaustion, but a deeper hush, the kind that comes just after something breaks or just before it changes forever. Hannah woke to whispers, not commands. The guards weren't shouting. The roll call was delayed. And then the translator stepped into the courtyard, pale and blinking, as if he too didn't know how to say it aloud. "The war," he said, "is over." No one moved. There was no cheering, no relief, just disbelief, as if the words themselves were traitors. For years, war had been the air they breathed, the purpose of every step. To hear it was over felt like being told gravity had stopped. Hannah didn't cry, neither did the others. Some sat down where they stood. One woman laughed, short and sharp like a bark. Another whispered a prayer so softly the syllables never left her lips. The guards didn't celebrate either. A few leaned against the fence, staring at the clouds like they expected a telegram from heaven. Cowboy was nowhere to be seen. Hannah stepped out into the yard, feet crunching on gravel. She walked the perimeter slowly, past the barracks that had once felt like tombs, past the latrines, past the water pump where a dozen hands had learned to wash in silence. And then she saw it, the garden. It had exploded into color almost overnight, unruly leaves spilling over the edges, tomatoes blushing red under the sun, lettuce heads curled like secret letters. Flowers had sprouted, too, wild and unexpected, blooming from soil no one had planted them in. It didn't look like it belonged to a prison anymore. Cowboy stood beside it, hands in his pockets, hat low. He didn't move until she was close. Then, almost as if it pained him to do so, he tipped his hat. That was all. No smile, no words, just that small, silent gesture. Then he walked away. He didn't look back. She didn't call after him, because there was nothing to say. His promise had not been a vow made for applause. It had been a quiet rebellion, one that ended the way all true acts of grace do, without ceremony. The war was over, but the weight of it remained. The barbed wire still stood, the walls hadn't fallen, but the violence that had written itself into every corner of the camp had been interrupted by a garden, by a forged name, by a medic who bent the rules until they broke. Hannah knelt by the tomato vine and plucked the ripest one gently. It was warm from the sun, its skin thin and taut. She split it in half and set one piece on the ground, for no one in particular. Maybe for the ones who didn't make it, maybe for the silence. Then she bit into the other half. The taste was sharp, sweet, alive. She didn't think of her old commanders. She didn't think of oaths or shame or defeat. She thought of Cowboy's hands, not the way they held a weapon, but the way they lifted her when she could not stand. She thought of the word wait scribbled on paper and how it had become a shield. And she thought of how, without saying it aloud, he had kept his promise. In the place built to erase her, something had grown, and it would keep growing long after he was gone. The ship rocked gently as it crept toward the scarred coastline of a country Hannah barely recognized. There were no welcome banners, no waving hands, no familiar sounds of home, only silence, broken by wind and gulls and the low rumble of a nation too tired to grieve. Her return to Japan was not triumphant. It was like slipping through a door that no longer fit its frame. The docks were littered with shattered wood and the ghosts of lost commerce. Her feet met the ground with hesitation, not because she feared it, but because she knew it wouldn't know her anymore. Her village, once nestled between rice fields and the old cedar shrine, was gone, flattened, burned. What remained was a smear of ash and twisted nails. She found a piece of her father's gate half buried in the dirt. Nothing else. The home she had imagined through fevered nights in the camp had never survived the war. Her surviving family, distant cousins, maybe, lived in the shell of a nearby town. When she arrived, they stared, thin, silent, unsure what to say to the woman who had vanished in a foreign prison and returned wearing American shoes. Her presence was both miracle and mystery. They gave her rice, a futon, space in the corner, no questions. But at night, Hannah lay awake, listening to their breath, feeling their grief rustle through the walls. They had endured without her, and she without them. But the pain was not equal. She carried something they didn't, a knowledge too heavy to speak, because Hannah had seen a different kind of mercy, and that mercy, once tasted, never leaves you. She didn't tell them about Cowboy. She didn't tell them about the garden or the forged papers or the act of rebellion sown quietly through kindness. It would have sounded like madness in a country still scraping boiled bark into soup. But she carried proof. Wrapped inside her clothes was a pouch, the same cloth he had once given her. Inside, dried seeds, carefully saved, some from the tomatoes, others from the flowers that had sprung wild behind the latrines. She waited a week. Then, one morning before sunrise, she slipped from the house and walked back to the ruins of her old street. The ground was hard, broken by fire and shrapnel. But there, between two collapsed beams, she found a patch of soil not yet claimed by weeds. She knelt, and with hands now calloused by survival, she planted. not for sustenance, not for beauty, but for memory. Each seed pressed into the dirt was a name unspoken. Each handful of earth was a promise. Weeks passed. Then, green, tiny leaves, first just 2, then more. Neighbors noticed. Children came closer. One asked if it would bear fruit. Hannah just nodded. She tended that plot daily, never explaining why, never claiming it as hers, because the garden was not just for her. It was for anyone who had been erased and had dared to return. It was for Cowboy, wherever he was, proof that his promise had taken root. It was for those who had believed that kindness was weakness, that mercy could not survive war. And now, when people passed that corner of rubble, they didn't see ruin. They saw life, growing quietly. If you're moved by this story so far, like this video, and leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. The years passed the way rivers swallow their own reflections, quietly, without announcement. War became a paragraph in textbooks. Camps became footnotes. Faces once etched in terror softened in photographs, and then faded altogether. Across an ocean, in a small town where the dust was redder and the skies wider, Cowboy's name dissolved into routine. Not a hero, not a story. Just another man who came home and learned how to be ordinary again. He worked with his hands after the war, fixing engines, repairing fences, teaching a boy down the street how to hold a hammer without bruising his thumb. He didn't speak much about where he'd been. People seldom asked. Silence was the uniform everyone wore once the fighting stopped. He kept a footlocker at the foot of his bed, old canvas, frayed at the edges. Inside were things that had survived the sea: a folded map, a dented canteen, a dried leaf pressed inside a medical manual, and one envelope, unsent. He wrote that letter days before his transfer out of the camp, when the garden was just beginning to swell, when the wire still hummed at night, when her hands were still wrapped in bandage. He had sat alone at a battered desk, listening to the generators protest in the distance, while insects thinned their bodies against the light bulb above him. He had addressed it carefully. Hannah, no last name, no country, just the truth of her being, written as gently as he had ever touched it. He didn't know where to send it. He didn't know if it would survive, but he wrote it anyway, because some things had to exist, even if they never arrived. He told her the truth he had never spoken aloud, that before the camp he'd believed what he was told, that enemies were machines, that prisoners were burdens, that kindness made you weak. And then you held a watering can like it was a lifeline, he wrote in slow, careful script, and you made me feel like a man again, not a uniform, not a number, just a man standing in dirt beside a woman who refused to vanish. He folded that page like he had folded bandages, neat, precise, as if order could hold back loss. Then he placed it inside the footlocker and shut the lid, and there it stayed. Decades later, after his passing, it was discovered by hands that did not recognize its weight. His niece had flown in from another state, sorting through the remnants of a life she had only known through Sunday visits and birthday cards. The attic was full of dust and heat and the dull smell of old paper. She coughed, she sneezed, she opened boxes of photographs and medals she didn't understand. And then she found the footlocker. She pried it open. Inside, among the war-worn artifacts, lay the envelope, yellowed, still sealed. She turned it over. "Hannah," it read, scrawled in familiar ink. No address, no stamp. Just a name carried patiently through time. She opened it, slowly, carefully. And as she read, something in the past, something unfinished, breathed. Again! He had written about the garden, how he had never seen green grow so stubbornly in such bare soil. He had confessed his fear, his anger, his shame for the ease with which he'd once accepted orders. He wrote about the moment he changed the list, about the night he barely slept, listening for boots outside his door. "You showed me that loyalty ain't about flags," he had written. "It's about people, living ones, breathing ones, the kind that kneel and plant when they're told to disappear." He did not apologize. He did not ask to be understood. He simply thanked her for teaching him that mercy was not weakness, for letting him practice it without ever calling his name, for surviving in a world that had tried to grind her down to dust. Hannah never read those words. She never knew they existed. She lived out her days tending soil, mending clothing, raising her daughter to treat strangers like unclaimed kin. But in a quiet attic in Texas, a letter carried her name, not as a ghost, not as a prisoner, but as proof that the smallest act of humanity can outlive borders, uniforms, and even memory itself. The girl was grown now. Hannah's daughter, Midori, stood in the same ruins her mother had once tended like sacred ground. Except they weren't ruins anymore. They were rows, green ones, a garden, stubborn and wild, that bloomed even through frost. No fence held it in, no orders dictated its shape. It grew the way people do when no one is watching, honest, unexpected, and free. She never knew the full story, just fragments, a whisper here, a name there, a coffee tin Hannah refused to throw away, though it had long gone empty, a tiny bar of soap wrapped in a cloth and tucked into a drawer like a relic, and seeds, always seeds, drying on trays, folded into paper, passed to neighbors with no explanation but a smile. And one sentence, spoken often. "A man once taught me not to give up on strangers." Midori hadn't understood it fully until now. The war, the camp, the garden, none of it had made it into textbooks, and Hannah, ever soft-spoken, never offered the full tale. She had simply lived like someone who had been cracked open once and then filled again with light. Now, standing where her mother once knelt, Midori finally understood. The resistance had not looked like rebellion. It had looked like decency. That man, Cowboy, had not stormed a barricade. He hadn't overthrown the system. He had poured soup into a chipped bowl. He had handed over seeds. He had risked everything for a name on a page, and in doing so he had disrupted a machine built on dehumanization. Because that's what war thrives on, turning people into numbers, slogans, enemies. Cowboy's crime had been refusing to play along. His weapon was not a gun. It was dignity. The soap he gave Hannah, a simple bar, was more than hygiene. It was restoration. The coffee, bitter and hot, was more than a drink. It was an invitation to remember who she was. The garden, grown in stolen soil, was more than survival. It was memory turned living. These artifacts weren't grand. They were quiet. But they proved something monumental, that the smallest acts, when done deliberately, can leave cracks in the darkest walls. Hannah had passed this knowing to her daughter not through speeches, but through practice. She taught Midori to serve tea with both hands, to remember names, to give freely and ask nothing back. Now, as Midori crouched to prune a stubborn vine, she saw children approaching from the path. One held an empty basket. Another had dirt under their nails. They weren't coming to watch. They were coming to help. Midori stood, brushed her hands clean, and smiled. She didn't need to explain, because the garden told the story now. The tomatoes, the flowers, the soap dish resting on a broken brick, the tin that still smelled faintly of roast and smoke. Each one said it plainly. Kindness is not weakness. Mercy is not surrender. And dignity, when held tightly, is the loudest form of resistance. In a war that tried to erase her mother, One illegal promise had redrawn her entirely, and now, generations later, the seeds were still being passed, still being planted, still growing. If this story touched you, like the video and drop a comment saying where you're watching from. Let's remember together.